Hi, I'm Karen, and I actually study gender in Disney movies for a living. It's not exactly what I thought I'd be doing with my life, but here we are. I study the way that language depicts gender in different animated films. Here I am, it's me. I'm researchers. So there's a new 2020 live-action remake of Mulan that came out back in September. A lot of people have actually already made really good video essays about it, and I encourage you to go watch them. We'll link them down in the description, especially if you like watching video essay makers just absolutely dunk on corporate trash. Go check it out. But I noticed that a lot of these essays are looking back at the 1998 animated version and kind of seeing it in a really favorable light, which honestly is fair in comparison to the trash fire that just came out.
It will be an examination of two interpretations of the exact same character. That character being Mulan, with the 1998 animated classic being a great example of a strong female character, and the 2020 remake being not so great.
Even though this movie was culturally inaccurate in places, that didn't stop me from enjoying it so much, because it had so much heart, which was what the 2020 movie was missing.
As for the rest of the movie, it was really bad. And if I was giving a storytelling class, then I would put both of these movies on and tell them to take notes from what the animated movie did and just completely ignore what the live-action remake did. It's time for the scores. The original Mulan gets a 10 out of 10, and the live-action remake gets a 3.
Now, honestly, I pretty much agree with most of these takes. I mean, first of all, Mulan 1998 absolutely slaps. When I think about the gender politics too, it's honestly pretty progressive, especially for the late 1990s. And in some ways, Mulan 2020 is kind of an embarrassing backward step when it comes to gender representation. But I do think that it's worth taking another look at Mulan 1998. When it comes to gender, yeah, in some ways it's super progressive, especially when it comes to Mulan, the main character herself. Mulan 1998, in my opinion, actually ends up being a really good case study about how a movie can construct different and even kind of conflicting political ideologies and gender ideologies depending on whether we decide to look only at the main character and her merits or look at the entire story world that the movie decides to build. So that's what I want to do today. We're going to take a look first at the movie itself and a little bit about how Mulan is and how she's treated. And then we're going to actually focus away from Mulan and look at the rest of the story world. When Mulan isn't on screen, what is happening and what does that tell us about what Disney is thinking about gender in this movie? Okay, so just a really quick rundown to start things off. Mulan is a 1998 animated film produced by Disney Animation Studios at the end of what's known as the Disney Renaissance, which was like a long 10-year string of super popular animated movies. The movie is a retelling of the ancient Chinese legend, the Ballad of Mulan, which dates back to the Southern Chen dynasty in the 6th century. The Ballad of Mulan is the story of a young girl who goes into the army to take her father's place. The basic plot of 1998 Mulan is kind of like this. Mulan is a quirky, awkward girl. She lives in ancient China. She's smart, but she does not really like or get the whole be a lady situation. In the opening number of the film, she's rushed through a woman ritual and being sent to the matchmaker to be judged for marriage. And boy, does she not do a very good job. Then, the military shows up because the Huns are attacking China and they need everyone to draft in. Mulan's dad gets drafted, but he is super old and weak. So Mulan decides to steal her dad's stuff and runs out to join the army in the middle of the night. She's joined by her family guardian Mushu, and they make a plan to infiltrate the army camp. Hijinks ensue. Mulan successfully trains for the army and avoids being caught and also makes some friends. Also, she develops a crush on her general Li Shang, which, same. Mushu tricks the army into moving out to war so that Mulan can prove herself. A huge battle ensues in which Mulan wins through being good and smart and stuff. Everybody loves her, but then there's an arrow problem, and she's found out to be a woman, and instead of being put to death, she's abandoned in the mountain pass. While she's there being sad, she sees that the Huns actually survived the battle, and they're on their way to the capital. Oh no. Mulan saddles up and goes to try and find her friends. But oops, no one believes her anymore.
Hey, you're a girl again, remember?
So she goes to try and solve the issue herself. A fight breaks out, and her friends join the scuffle. The movie climaxes in a showdown between Mulan and the leader of the Huns, where Mulan emerges victorious. The Emperor offers her a place on his council as a reward, but she refuses and opts instead to go back home to her family. And the super hunk Li Shang eventually follows her there.
Would you like to stay for dinner?
Would you like to stay forever?
End scene. So this movie obviously has a lot of things to say about gender. In a lot of ways, the central theme of the movie is what it means to be yourself as a woman, especially in a world where patriarchal forces are trying their best to stifle who you really are. And I mean also, there is a huge girl power vibe to this movie. Like if there's one thing that this film really wants you to walk away from it with, it's that women who do things are cool and good, and people who think that women can't do things are dumb and bad. And boy, do they hit that message home. As the New York Times said, even the tiniest viewer should see how wrongly and repressively Mulan is being treated. In case they missed the point, the film shows girls and boys being made to play with dolls and swords respectively and not being allowed to switch roles. The movie presents us with this world where gender norms are extremely rigid and violently enforced. Actually, the way that they put this across is overt misogyny that is so over the top that it's kind of ham-handed most of the time.
Please, sir. My father has already fought for
Silence! You would do well to teach your daughter to hold her tongue in a man's presence.
I know my place. It is time you learned yours.
I knew there was something wrong with you. A woman. Treacherous snake.
So on top of just showing us this kind of over-the-top misogyny as a case study in what not to do, the movie also delivers us a couple of real thesis statement kind of moments about Mulan's heroism and how foolish it would be for anyone not to believe in her just because she's a woman.
You said you'd trust Ping. Why is Mulan any different?
The movie's message about gender really crystallizes at the end, where Mulan, having just completed a string of superheroic acts, comes head-to-head with Shifu, the voice of misogyny throughout the film. And the two characters are judged by the Emperor himself, and it's iconic.
That creature's not worth protecting.
She's a hero.
She's a woman. She'll never be worth anything.
Listen, you pompous. That is enough.
Mulan's got some really tough moves.
Yeah, she's pretty good for a girl.
You're caveman. Girls can be fighters too.
Busted.
A lot of critics at the time were really picking up what Mulan was putting down and had a lot of really good things to say about the way that Mulan was depicted. Mulan isn't like past Disney animated efforts in one important respect: the title character herself. Where many past Disney heroines have been passive or dependent or waiting for Prince Charming to come and save the day, Mulan takes matters into her own hands. When her aging warrior father is conscripted to fight the Huns, she cuts off her hair, disguises herself, and takes his place in the army. She's smart, she's strong, she's resourceful, and she's Asian, a Disney first. If Prince Charming did show up, she'd probably find him a bore. I think even going beyond just the surface reading of like empowered woman is good, there is an attempt in this movie at some surprisingly progressive gender philosophy, particularly in the way that the movie really highlights gender as performance. The movie makes a lot of intentional nods to the fact that a lot of what we consider on the day-to-day to be gender is actually just a series of performances that can be manipulated instead of like our essential nature or something. Particularly what comes to mind is the juxtaposition of "You'll Bring Honor to Us All," the opening number, and then "Be a Man." These are two songs about teaching somebody how to be a woman and teaching somebody how to be a man. It seems like a particularly blatant attempt to see masculinity and femininity as two different performances that Mulan just has to learn. You could argue that this framing of gender as performance is a surprisingly spicy take for a Disney movie in the late 90s. And honestly, I think it's great. It's very third wave, very Judith Butler. We love to see it. But, So Mulan's plot is, it's fine. It's actually really well constructed from like a movie making point of view. And Mulan herself is probably my favorite Disney princess. But I'm not actually going to spend that much longer talking about Mulan herself or her choices of actions in her world. I actually think, honestly, too, we get this kind of weird hang-up about talking about female characters in kids' movies in particular. Like, we get so caught up in, like, who is Mulan? Is she cool? Is she empowered? What's she like? What's she doing? And whether or not she's just a good role model, that we forget to pay attention to, like, the entire rest of the movie. Like, even though main characters are the focal point of the movie, obviously, they really are just that. They're a point. They're a kind of a smaller section of a much larger story world that the movie is constructing. And each and every choice that filmmakers make, from which side characters to include, to what the humor looks like, to the physical and social rules of the world that characters inhabit, these all have political implications, regardless of whether or not our attention is drawn to them and regardless of whether or not they impact the main plot. I think the distinction between main characters and plot and sort of the background story world are especially obvious when we look at genres like science fiction or fantasy, because often in those movies, instead of just messing with the main character in their life, we're messing with the story world itself and actually using the plot to explore what would an alteration in our fundamental story world look like. Like, what would the world look like if it was the same but with magic, or the same but robots looked and acted like humans? Other times, stories kind of function in story worlds where parts of our world have been selectively left out for the convenience of plot instead of actively altered. This works fine sometimes. In other cases, it can manifest in these like huge plot holes that CinemaSins might point out. Like, why are we spending so much time with magic wands when guns exist?
Master has given Dobby a Glock.
Sometimes this kind of storytelling can go really, really wrong if story worlds are altered incorrectly. Consider, for example, Zootopia, which is on one hand a story about fighting racism and not assuming anything about anybody, but on the other hand has this like wildly rigid view, literally biological coding about the difference between different species, which is super racist. In fact, in a way, like all sort of what if humans were animals kind of stories do run into these kind of problems of how to sort of take the main plot and make it work with this story world premise that you have thought up for yourself. Jack Saint has a really great video on different ways that this has been accomplished in the past. Hey. So you have your well-constructed and interesting story worlds, you have your poorly constructed story worlds, your dissonant story worlds, but you know, in a lot of things that aren't speculative, the background just kind of exists. No attention is called to it. We all kind of move on because that's not what we're supposed to be paying attention to. Except those of us who are obsessed with analyzing literally every goddamn thing about a piece of media. Because you know what? It's all made up. We know that. But it's still ideology. It's still a matter of representing the world selectively onto a screen. And a team still made a choice about what needs to exist in the story world in order for it to make sense. And in a world where everything is political, that's political. Hello? In fact, I would argue that because the sort of story world of a given movie is sort of hanging out in the background, seeming to just provide a backdrop, it actually might excel at normalization of certain political ideologies because we are specifically being asked not to think about it. Like, you look at the plot and you say, okay, this is what I should care about. And then there's this whole heap of stuff that you're not thinking about. So when we choose what to selectively reproduce in a given story world, we learn things about the status quo, about what is and isn't possible, about what does and does not exist, and we're just supposed to take those in stride, at least for the story to make sense. It's a story world. So we finally arrived at why I actually think Mulan 1998 is so interesting. It's exactly because the main character, Mulan, is actually pretty fucking good by Disney princess standards that I think that we should take a step back and see about the story world that she lives in. Are the social rules, the things that exist, the things that seem easy or hard in this world actually as progressive as Mulan herself? I would argue no. They're weird and regressive, and we're going to talk about it. Okay, listen up, my dudes. I can already hear some of you just cracking the old knuckles and getting ready to type out your responses like, you can't talk about this like it's a fictional world. It's set in ancient China. It's historical. All right. Now, I know I'm officially kind of stepping out of my lane here because I'm not Chinese, but based on research I've done, I think I can say at least briefly, yeah, the story of Mulan 1998 is deeply fictional and it is very white. And for a lot of reasons. For example, when this Disney story was originally conceived, it was actually the combination of two different source materials. First, the Ballad of Mulan, but also a different, super weird, work-in-progress straight-to-video film called China Doll. I can't. Which was about a sad-oppressed Chinese girl who is whisked away to the West by a British hunk. The projects were combined to create this story. The story that is in the Ballad of Mulan is crazy inaccurate in terms of the time period. For example, that scene where she chops her hair off with a sword, it wasn't a thing that different genders had different lengths of hair, at least not in this way. The costumes are crazy anachronistic. There weren't even matchmakers at the time that the story was supposed to be told. Mushu is an obvious add-in character that takes the dragon, one of the most prized Chinese mythological creatures, and turns it into a tiny comic relief lizard named after a mushroom dish because the director was working on a different film at the time where he was animating a dragon and he wanted to keep doing that. So.
Does Mushu mean dragon in Chinese? I think it's a kind of food.
That's right, Tom. It's a Chinese dish, kind of like a soft taco.
I mean, look, this was the 90s. Politics then were not what they are now, and this was a completely white team of artists that put together the storyboard with basically no cultural input. And in order to do research, they did spend 18 whole days in China taking pictures and really thought they were doing something.
We'll travel to China with the film's producer and directors to learn how this vast and ancient country influenced their film.
We went for 3 weeks and took, I believe, close to 9,000 pictures and then probably 24 hours of video.
But even if all that weren't true, I mean, even if they did a really good job representing historical China, which, again, let me be clear, they didn't, but even if they did, as far as I understand, the heart of the Ballad of Mulan is really not about the theme that 1998 Disney made it out to be. It's not about just being yourself in a world that wants to keep you down. It's about loyalty. It's about loyalty to your family and loyalty to your nation. What's more, and again, this is just my personal understanding, but the original ballad didn't actually have Mulan really facing off against sexism or misogyny in any meaningful way. I mean, she was already adept at her feminine role in society, and when she decided to take the place of her father, her parents actually help her to do this instead of trying to keep her down. I think the discussion of the themes of the original Ballad of Mulan is definitely its own conversation and one that I don't necessarily feel equipped to have. But what I'm trying to say is that it is not the story of an ultra-repressive society trying to keep a powerful woman down. It's just not the vibe of the original. You know, and if we might add, the movie absolutely tanked overseas in China despite really aggressive marketing. Because the story that it told, even though it looked like Mulan, fundamentally wasn't Chinese. It was a weird oriental reskin of this Western story of self-fulfillment. You know, and if Mulan 2020 has taught us anything, it's really not a matter of doing more aesthetic research, making things more historically accurate, or spending more money on on-site filming. If anything, all of the nods toward accuracy in the new film make it feel even more problematic because it's using this veneer of historicism and this guise of authenticity to make this weird movie about like a chi superhero, which isn't a thing, but also is just even more a story of Western exceptionalism than the 1998 version was. I have feelings about this. Okay. If you do want to find out though more about the ways that either the older 1998 movie or the new one kind of hits and misses in terms of resonating with the original ballad or with Chinese history, you should really go check out these two videos. They are really fascinating and have way more expertise on the subject than I could ever muster. But even if that weren't true, like even if this version of Mulan was a perfect retelling of the original ballad, or if this wasn't a legend at all, if it was just some slice of life piece that had no speculative or no historical elements, every story world is still constructed, and even non-fiction has a story world that is communicating something politically. Because choosing to not include or to include any specific elements that represent real life is still going to be a choice that drives your narrative, and it's still going to be a choice that influences how audiences are going to understand the world around them. Okay, let's get down to business and actually talk about what the story world in Mulan is actually communicating about gender. Yeah, so here's the funny thing about making your dramatic arc center around whether or not a woman is going to be able to pass as a man, is that your story world has to do a lot of lifting to sell gender passing as a challenge. Mulan does this in quite a few ways, all of which I think make a picture of gender that's a little bit more rigid and regressive than the main character might necessarily suggest. First of all, Mulan 1998 dials the logistical challenge of crossing genders all the way up to 11. The worlds of masculinity and femininity are absolutely separate, and the hierarchy is immovable. The family is unsupportive, and the professionals are all dicks. Obviously, sneaking into an all-male war camp is going to be a logistical challenge, like I don't think anybody's arguing that, but I don't think that the time period necessarily implied as many obstacles as are in the movie. But outside of logistics, I also mean challenge in a way more fundamental way. You see, main character Mulan lives in this weird space where we've been assured that yes, she's very smart, but she doesn't super identify with the women around her and she just wants to be herself. The movie wants to tell us that joining the army will help her do this, but when we get there, we're immediately greeted with gag after gag after gag centered on Mulan's absolute incompetence at imitating men.
Ha! I see you have a sword. I have one too. They're very manly and tough.
This is true even when she gets a mentor whose self-proclaimed mission is only to help her out with this problem.
Shoulders back, chest high, feet apart, head up, and strut.
And then there are like these totally neutral actions, like spitting or something, that are things that the movie first goes out of its way to gender and then shows that Mulan is weirdly bad at. The movie just goes to weird lengths at every turn to show us that Mulan, even though she's talented, clever, and persevering, just cannot imitate men very well. This uncrossable difference fuels a lot of the comedy and a fair amount of the dramatic tension in the first half of the movie. Gender crossing also seems to be an emotional challenge. Like, even though Mulan wants to be in the army, she doesn't actually really want to be a man.
They're disgusting.
No, they're men.
Just because I look like a man doesn't mean I have to smell like one.
It's just unfortunate that a movie that so centrally frames things like gender performativity and cross-dressing goes so far out of its way to show us that, like, don't worry guys, like Mulan is still a woman and she still is fundamentally a woman inside. She doesn't want to be a man. Like, she doesn't really want to dress like a man because, like, who could possibly want that for whatever reason? Even though I think one other really interesting thing about Mulan 1998 is that it goes really far to lift up this one extraordinary woman, Mulan, as a hero, but in doing so kind of throws like every other woman and also the concept of femininity itself completely under the bus. Okay, I know this is kind of nitpicky, but like, bear with me here. Let's look closely at You'll Bring Honor to Us All and Be a Man as a set of two songs. So I already mentioned how both of these are a wink and a nod to gender performance, but let's look at them a little closer. The honor sequence tells us a couple of things. First, femininity in this world is a shallow and oppressive force. Almost everything they talk about is a concrete performative duty. Makeup, waist size, childbearing, a great hairdo. This is what femininity means in this world. We follow Mulan through a world of women who have bought wholesale into this idea of womanhood and who all seem to have undergone some kind of training that she just like hasn't. Like, literally, where has she been? Mulan is just so not like other girls that she cannot bring herself to do any of it. And oh man, does she get the shit kicked out of her for it. The institution of femininity in this movie is mean and oppressive and generally just not kindly looked on by the film. Okay, let's compare that against Be a Man. My earlier, more charitable interpretation of these two songs was that they showed similar performative elements to each gender. But y'all, there's a reason why one of these is a quaint opening number and the other one is a fucking rad as hell power jam, okay? Be a Man has some tension and humor in it, mostly because we know that Mulan isn't a man. But other than that, it's kind of just a straight up celebration of masculinity. Am I right? It's also worth noting that Where You'll Bring Honor to Us All is full of these shallow concrete performances. Be a Man is full of more personality-driven virtues. Being strong, being swift, being forceful, mysterious. Whereas femininity is beads.
Beads of jade for beauty.
Masculinity in the world of Mulan has a substance to it that femininity does not. And you know, by the end of Be a Man, we see Mulan eventually acclimating and then excelling in this world of masculinity. And this is presented as a huge triumph in the scope of the film. But had she similarly acclimated and excelled in the performance of femininity in You'll Bring Honor to Us All, the audience would have been expected to see this as a defeat. I think it's just that overall, the movie gives really different weights to the two gendered performances that they want to talk about. Like, of course, yeah, I really get the point that they're trying to hammer home that women have been oppressed and that nobody should settle for that. And I think that that's a really respectable point to make. But when it comes to femininity, it's not just the fact that women are oppressed that is under fire in this film. It's kind of the feminine nature itself. The women who are upholding the structures, even the feminine half of Mulan, in like a very serious and emotional moment in the scene, is being wiped away. I think that what happened here is honestly something that happened a lot in movies in the 80s and 90s, where they equate everything feminine to everything oppressive about being a woman. And in doing so, I think they're trying to make people who are empowered, but kind of just end up like shitting on the institution of femininity as a whole in like fun and creative ways.
Are most girls more interested in the pretty maidens from the songs? Jonquil, flowers in her hair?
Most girls are idiots.
I feel like I'm belaboring this point mostly because when you look at the way masculinity is treated in the movie, I mean, honestly, the world of men, we see a lot of behaviors that like, aren't that cute? Like, I know that it's not like Mulan wants to be a man, but nor does the movie particularly go out of its way to condemn a lot of things that I would say are kind of problems.
Punch him is how men say hello.
Wow, it seems like we're encouraging men to literally introduce themselves by punching each other.
Hey!
Wow, it seems like they're so socially pressured to engage in violence that they end up destroying their own living space.
Are you hungry?
Yeah, because I owe you a knuckle sandwich.
Wow, they only responded to this conflict with threats of even more violence. Men, am I right? Really cute. No problems here. No problems with this ideology at all. No problems. Everything is fine. Women's culture is just under fire in a way that men's culture isn't in this movie, unless it's the case where a man is like making some wildly overstated cartoon villain put down of a woman. That isn't to say that men aren't made fun of or put down in this movie. It's just the fact that masculinity is like never the butt of those jokes. In fact, you know what? I'm glad we're talking about this. When are men made fun of in this movie?
And I do not squeal like a girl.
I think that within the endless riffing on the idea of gender crossing and the humor of this movie, one idea that comes up a lot is the idea that when men slide away from the masculine ideal and more towards femininity or womanliness, it's hilarious. Chifu, who's animated as small and scrawny and not super masculine, is the butt of a lot of these jokes.
You men owe me a new pair of slippers!
But other men are too, for all kinds of things, like wanting to be clean. It's funny because we thought hygiene was a girl thing. Also, being scared of snakes, having patterned clothes, writing politely, not being the king of the rock. And if you think these jokes are a reflection of the same culture that thinks it's gay to eat yogurt and that birthed man can wine, well, you'd be right. I think one really interesting moment in the movie is when Mulan hatches this really good plan to get the soldiers up into the Imperial Palace. And the crux of the plan is that they have to dress up like women, and all of them go along with it, except for true hunk Li Shang, who would never. Basically, I think the point is supposed to be something like, oh, it's a callback because she's been dressing up like a man the whole time, and like now they have to dress up like women. Ooh, it's like very clever. But gender scholar Gwendolyn Limbach has something really interesting to say about this scene. She says, in this scene, the men are not figures of power, but figures of parody. The three concubines are revealed in harsh lighting and strike bold masculine poses despite their clothing. Their change is a spectacle meant to elicit audience laughs rather than challenge their so-called innate maleness. Where Mulan must viably pass as a man to uphold family honor and not be killed for treason, the men do not attempt to truly pass as women. They remain only men in women's clothes. Nor do their lives and honor depend on successfully cross-dressing. It is treated almost as a lark. With the reprise of Make a Man Out of You in the background, the scene renders Mulan's previous transgression as a joke rather than any powerful statement. And as Cho's particular word choice asserts, the cross-dressing is poetic justice for abandoning Mulan. The soldiers are feminized as punishment. In this moment, the message is clear. Femininity is ridiculous, and it should be mocked when men exhibit it. Basically, there's a big difference between this and this.
Ugly concubines.
Okay, I feel like that's a lot of thoughts. I don't want to come out of this with anybody thinking that I hate Mulan 1998, or even that I think it's a bad movie at all. I love Mulan 1998, and I think it's really well made. And when you compare it against Mulan 2020, it comes out looking even better, both in terms of script quality and in terms of its gender politics. Like, I'm really not trying to call anybody's fave out as problematic. In fact, I pretty explicitly want to not do that. I actually think that these one-dimensional kind of analyses like Mulan good or Mulan bad aren't only inadequate, but they might actually obscure greater points that we could be making about these movies. You know, like, we're not just watching Mulan the princess, we're watching Mulan the film, and there's a lot going on under the hood. And if we spend all of our time just looking at Mulan and her choices, we're going to miss a lot of the political implications of the world that's been set up to make those choices matter. Yeah, so basically, to quote Lindsay Ellis, forever until I die, I'm not trying to say thing bad. I'm just trying to say thing exists, and thing is a part of a system that you might not be conscious of. All I'm saying is that even though Mulan is a really great character, the Storyworld makes her great in part by doing things like lionizing masculinity as the center of virtue, devaluing femininity as just another oppressive performance. It emphasizes gender hierarchies and ultimately just works to reinforce a natural gender binary. I just think that all of this background noise to me colors the central message of the film to the point that it changes it away from what could have been this rad queer narrative about how gender is just performance and you can be whatever you want to be, into this kind of weird story about how one woman just was extraordinary and rose above and conquered just the fact that she was a woman. Because yeah, the main characters are telling one political message about what's good or extraordinary or moral, sure, but the background is telling just as important of a story about what exists, how the world works, how the world should be, what's possible, what's funny, what's not funny, all of which have their own political impact, and all of which are rendered all the more potent by the fact that we take them for granted. That's a wrap, baby! I'm excited for you to put together a blooper reel. Hello. What's up? I'm Jared, I'm 19, and I never fucking learned how to read. Am I in a good pose? Is this good? Am I doing it? Am I a star? The basic plot of 1998 about the way that gender kind of exists in our space. I'm gonna have to do that one again. We follow Mulan through a world of Mulan who... Cool. Let's move on. Story about, so surprisingly, sneaking into a male... again! And also a weird sorry.
I was like, stop.
Whether, okay, I'll try again. You didn't like that? Can you actually scroll it down further? But looking back now, does kind of just feel like different, new, fun ways to like shit on women. Phrasing? So I don't know. Maybe next time you're watching some movies, pay attention to the background world. Just do it. I don't know.
Nice job, dude. My hands are sweaty, but
hey,
fuck yeah.
Mom spaghetti. Am I right?